Welcome back, everyone, to Prophet, Judge, and King in Deuteronomy with Rabbi David Silber, part of Sphere Zman at Drisha. This is session 4 of 5. The book of Deuteronomy has a focus on institutions, which will be central to the establishment of society. These sessions will focus on king, judge, and prophet as defined in Deuteronomy. It's been a pleasure learning with Rabbi Silber, the Dean of Drisha, for these past few weeks, and sources for today's class will be shared on screen as well as but if you have your own Tanakh, you're more than welcome to follow along. And with that, I will hand things over to Rabbi Silber.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, we started last week to look at the section in the book of Dvarim that deals with kingship. In the Torah, there's one section that deals with the institution of kingship, which is in the book of Dvarim, chapter 17, beginning in the 14th pasuk. And I wanted to pick up, once again, to look at this very significant little parsha. It's a few verses long. And today to look at the parsha here, but to look at it through the eyes of a different book, which is the book of Shmuel. The book of Shmuel's main focus, what the book is about, it's about kingship. In the book, of course, there were two kings, King Saul, Shaul HaMelech, and of course David, the main character of the book. But the larger issue in the book is kingship, and the book has a particular take on kingship. It's called the book of Samuel, the book of Shmuel. Anybody who's read the book of Shmuel understands that Shmuel himself, Shmuel the prophet, is opposed to kingship. So we have a book about kingship, which is called the book of Samuel, in which the name of the book, named after Samuel, is about a person who's opposed to kingship. And that raises the question, actually, what is the book's attitude towards kingship? One might say, what is God's attitude towards kingship? Because presumably God's attitude towards kingship and the book's attitude towards kingship are one and the same. And the answer to that is it's not fully clear. The book certainly raises the problems with kingship. Shmuel himself raises those problems, and the stories in the book reflect some of Shmuel's concerns. On the other hand, God tells Shmuel to listen to the people. We saw that in chapter 8 of the first book of Shmuel. And again, in the chapter I want to look at today, because it's relevant to this our parsha in Devarim, God proactively and preemptively tells Samuel to find a different king after King Saul has been declared by God and by Samuel to be inappropriate. The kingship of Saul will not continue. That takes place after the battle against Amalek in the 15th chapter of Shmuel Aleph, as I'm sure we all know. But then God instructs Samuel to find a different king. God could have said at that point, you try, we had an experiment, it didn't work, so let's drop kingship, which would make Samuel very happy. But that's not what God says. So we want to take a look at that, and also how the book of Shmuel sort of reads this parsha, which is very interesting in general. It's specifically interesting in this case, but more generally speaking, how one text reads another. So let's go back first to the parsha in Sefer Dvarim, which is chapter 17, verse number 14. It says, Ki tavo el haaretz asher Adonai Elohecha noten lach v'yirishta v'yashavta ba v'yamarta asima alai melech kechol hagoyim asher svivotai. When you come into the land and you inhabit the land, you possess the land, and you say, I will place, that means I wish to place upon myself a king like all the nations who are about me. So we started last week by pointing out that the idea of being like all the nations, specifically in the book of Devarim, is a total and complete non-starter. The book of Devarim takes great pains to distinguish the responsibilities of Israel and the behavior of Israel from other nations. It does so in many places, actually, but it actually does so in the very next chapter. And we saw those verses when it talks about prophets and prophecy. Other nations have their sorcerers, diviners, etc. in chapter 18. you have a prophet. So the idea of what other nations do as some kind of barometer as to what Israel should do is completely out of the question. The book, if there's anything central to the book of Devarim, it's when you come into the land, you have a different way to live. You have different responsibilities. You have different modes of service of God. You can't even use the services that they are using for your God. That we already encountered that. So the idea of coming into the land and saying we want to be like the other nations cannot possibly, in the context of Sefer Devarim, be something positive. But then the question is, what is the next verse? So to repeat what I suggested last week, Som tosim olecha melech. You shall place upon yourself a king. Som tosim olecha melech can be read two ways. One way to read it is, you are free to do it, which is the translation we have here in the JPS translation. You want to have a king like other nations? You're free to do it. Your choice, I'm not going to stop you. That's one way to read it. Som tosim alecha melech, though, if you take those words in and of themselves, it sounds more like, it doesn't sound like you're free to do it. Som tosim alecha melech sounds like appoint for yourself a king. It sounds like we are in fact encouraged, if not commanded, to do so. So those are two different ways to read it. Is Som tosim alecha melech mean you're free to do it? You have free will. Or does Som tosim alecha melech mean do it? Appoint a king. That's a good thing. Good thing that you want a king. However, and here we come to the however, that's what I wanted to pick up on. We began this last week. Appoint for yourself a king. However, Asher yivchar Adonai Elohecha bo, but one that God chooses. Now, you can have a king, but God will choose the king. Now, does that mean God will choose the king? Or does that mean God, you should choose a king, but you should choose a king that God would choose? In other words, not just any old person can be king. The person you are choosing to be king is one that God would choose. I'll come back to that in a few minutes. And then we have the rest of the verse, of course, Bikerev achecha tosim alecha melech, choose the king from one of your brethren. You're not permitted to go to chal ateit alecha ish nachri asher lo achichahu. Now, of course, as I mentioned last week, and the question I think is obvious, the Ramban asked the question as well, if God is making the choice, what does it mean you can't choose a foreigner? You're not choosing. God is choosing. So why does the Torah have to tell you you can't have a foreigner? One that's not your brother, not your relative, not part of your family or part of your nation. If God is actually making the choice. And therefore, what it sounds like, given the end of the verse, it sounds like it's not that God is making the choice, but what the Torah is saying is, you want a king, you can have a king. Maybe it's even a good thing. We talked about that last week, why it might be a good thing, why it might express some positive value of taking responsibility, but not like the other nations. The other nations have different kinds of kings, not for you. Your king has to be one that God would choose. And number two, and here's the interesting point, from amongst your brethren. Now we have to see, what does it mean from amongst your brethren? Does it simply say you can't have a foreigner? Or is it saying something more than that? Is it saying that the person who is chosen to be king is one of your brethren, which we could possibly read, and I think we should read it, as someone who understands that he is a brother. That is, he's responsible for his brethren. That is the way. That's a different way to understand it. It's not a technicality. In fact, as I'm talking, I'm thinking about something else, which is, and it's not inappropriate given the fact that the book of Devarim is the book of Moses. And we remember when Moshe was first chosen by God, God picked Moshe out to deliver Israel from slavery. And Moshe asked God, what is your name? What is your name? And God gave two answers to Moshe back there in the third chapter of Shemot. One is Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh, I am that I am, or I will be which I will be. And one question, when we studied that, we raised the question, is that a name? Or is God saying something else? Don't ask me my name. I am what I am. That's one way to read it. But then God continued. And God said, when you go to the people, And if they ask what is the name, well, actually, God says to Moshe, let me tell you something else. I'm the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That's my name. The God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The God of your father, says God. I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. In other words, Moshe, you are the child of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That's God's response to Moshe. What is your name? But later in the chapter, later when Moshe dialogues with God at the burning bush, Moshe says, the people are going to ask me what is your name? To which God says, tell the people that the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God of your ancestors, has spoken to you. Says Shmi, that's my name forever. That's how I shall be recalled. In other words, what God's saying to Moshe is, you and the people have something in common. You have the same ancestors. You have the same parents. You, Moses, are the son of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And the people are the children of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So you, Moshe, are their leader. You're also their brother. And that is what you have over here, perhaps, with the king. One of your brethren is more than just a technicality, perhaps. And I think there's a basis for saying that as we study this morning together in the parasha of the king. In any event, we'll come back to that very important point. Now, what I wanted to do just to stop for a moment now and to take a look at the book of Shmuel, chapter 16. Shmuel Aleph, chapter 16. Let's take a look at that together. Shmuel Aleph, chapter 16. Let's see where we have this. Chapter 15 is when Saul is told that his kingship is going to end. He'll have no continuity to his kingship. Let's take a look at the top of the page, chapter 16. Here's this. Vayomer Adonai o Shmuel, ad motai ata mitaber o Shaul, v'ani ma'astiv mimlocha Yisrael. Malei karnecha shemen, v'lechesh lochacha o Yishai beit halachmi, ki ra'iti bivanav limelech. God said to Samuel, how long will you grieve over Saul? He's mitaber, he's in mourning over Saul. I rejected him as king. Fill your horn with oil, set out. I am sending you to Jesse from Beit Lechem. I have decided on one of his sons to be king. So here we have a very interesting verse. Saul is gone. That's what God says. That's what Shmuel said to Shaul in chapter 15. And it would have been a perfect time to say, we experimented with kingship. It didn't work. So let's go back to the old model. Or maybe the judges. Somebody's called, filled with the Spirit of God, and rises up to save the people. No kingship, no dynasty. But that's not what God says. God says, stop the mourning, stop the grieving for Saul. He's gone. I rejected him. Go to the house of Yishai from Beit Lechem. I have seen one of his children for me, to see or to choose. Sometimes to see means to choose. I have chosen, I would say, one of his boys to be the king. And Samuel is the kingmaker. Samuel is the one who anoints the king. Samuel is the one that people asked to anoint the king. They said to Shmuel, you're old, choose a king for us. Was that a rejection of Samuel? Though he may think so. It's a rejection of his children, yes. It's a rejection of that kind of leadership, yes. But the people, God commands Shmuel, you go to the house of Yishai. Vayomer Shmuel, echelech, v'shama Shaul v'haragani. So Shmuel says to God, how could I go? Shmuel questions God's command. Vayomer Hashem eglat bakar tikach biyodecha v'yamarta lizboach l'Hashem bati. A very interesting verse from both perspectives. Both from the perspective looking at Samuel, the great prophet of God, the dedicated prophet to God. God gives him a task, and he doesn't run away like Jonah did, but he says, hey, I can't do that. Saul will kill me. It's too dangerous. What? What do you mean it's too dangerous? God says to go, it's not too dangerous. And even if it is too dangerous, you go, right? So it's very strange that Shmuel would raise such a question. I'm afraid for my life. He'll find out, he'll kill me. How can I go? And God says to Shmuel, that's okay, go. Take with you a heifer and say, I have come to sacrifice to God. Is God suborning perjury over here? Is God saying to him, you can bend the truth. There are situations you don't have to tell the whole truth. You're bringing a sacrifice. Now, as far as God is concerned, our question about what God is saying over here, it could be certainly possible that what God is saying is understand your concerns. It's a real danger. And under danger, you have to bend the truth. Now, he is going to bring a sacrifice, but I think there's more to it than that. Because what's interesting about the book of Shmuel, and actually the first chapter of the next book, Kings, is that the setting for kingship, the setting for the anointing or appointing of a king, is typically a sacrificial setting. It's true what Avshalom does when he rebels. It's true of David. It's true of Saul's choosing. He comes to the city when Samuel's bringing a sacrifice. It's true of Adoniah, who wants to make himself the king. He brings sacrifices, etc. So it's not actually a lie at all, because the setting for the anointing of kingship and the appointing of kingship, the choosing of kingship, is actually sacrifice. It's not our topic, but it's a very interesting observation. In any event, the karatu Yishai bazavach, and you will invite Yishai, going to Yishai's house, for ochi odiacha et asher taseh, and I will tell you what to do. Umoshachto li et asher omar elecha, and you will anoint the one that I tell you. And when you read these verses, even those amongst us who haven't studied the book of Shmuel intensively, I recommend everybody study the book intensively. But there's something interesting about what's going on over here, inasmuch God could have said to Shmuel, listen, go to the house of Yishai. There's a kid there named David. Anoint him as the king. That's not what God does. God doesn't mention a particular child at all. God says, go to Jesse's house. When you get there, I'll tell you what to do. In the very first verse, God said, I have seen, Ra'iti li, I've seen for myself, one of his children shall be the king. So there's something interesting over here. And the expression, go there, and when you get there, I'll tell you what to do. For those who remember the book of Shmuel and learned it very well, that's actually what Samuel said to Saul when he first meets him. You have this sign, you have this sign, you go to this place, and when I get there, I'll tell you what to do. I can't get into that over now, but clearly there's a connection between these two parallel statements. In any event, Vayash Shmuel et Hashem diber Hashem vayavo belechem.
Excuse me, Rabbi Silber. Can I ask a question?
Yes.
So you were saying that it's Sandra, that the setting for kingship is typically sacrificial. You said this right
Yes.
after we asked, is God suborning perjury? Is he bending the truth? Is it a sub silencio way of saying a wink and a nod? Do it this way. And I thought what you were going to say when you said the setting for kingship is typically, I thought the last few words would be a setting where truth is bent. Because, of course, the next book we're told that we meet David is old and cold, and the prophet who always tells the truth. Okay, and Bathsheba maybe cook up something that is or is not true. In other words, I thought what you were going to say is that the setting for kingship is often what God has essentially done to Psukim before by bending the truth slightly. Perhaps
that could be. That is an interesting observation. I have a lot to say about that. I'm not going to talk about it now. You're certainly correct about what happens when David is dying. Even the prophet doesn't tell the truth. That is correct, and it's maybe part of kingship. That by definition, the kingship and politics. Look, there's a king and a prophet. The prophet has one job, to tell the truth, which is why it's a very dangerous job, because people don't actually want to hear the truth. They say they want to hear the truth, But very often when you tell them the truth, they're very unhappy with the truth. So that's the role of the prophet. It's a dangerous job. That's why some prophets get killed. The king's job is, hopefully the king is honest, but the king has a different kind of job, and part of that job is it's the king for all the people. There are a lot of competing interests, and it's not so simple to just tell the truth, because the other piece of it is you're in charge of the whole community, 12 tribes, many clans, etc. So almost by definition, there's going to have to be a lot of compromise. And the Talmud speaks about compromise. On one hand, you can't function without peace. On the other hand, every compromise has an element of something which is not true. Because typically when there's a dispute between two people, one of them may be right and the other one may be wrong. Either you owe me the money, you don't owe me the money. So that is very true. They're two totally different tasks. And to that degree, there's always going to be a tension between the prophet and the king. But my point here was, and I don't disagree with your larger point, but anyway, the point I was making was about that. Actually, it's interesting to note that in every case of appointing kings, there's sacrifice. And that was just a simple observation. But the point you're raising, the larger point, is a whole other question, important question.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, so let's continue then. So we have so fine. So fine. So Shmuel goes. Fine. So now, Vayechedu ziknei ikrato vayomer shalom bolecha. When he comes to the city, Vayechedu ikrato. How did they translate Vayechedu? Vayechedu, they went out in alarm. I think that's true. Lacharod means to fear. They trembled. They trembled out to greet him. Do you come on a peaceful errand? They're concerned. Maybe they heard about the fallout between Saul and Samuel. In any event, why are you here? Why have you come to Beit Lechem? Shmuel, we were told earlier in the book of Shmuel, has a regular route that he walks. He's sort of a circuit judge. But Beit Lechem is not on the itinerary typically. So here they're concerned. What brings you here? I would say, do you come in peace? Question mark. Right? Vayomer Shalom. He said, I'm coming in peace. Lizborach Hashem Bati. I've come to bring a sacrifice. Hitkadshu votem iti bazevach. Vayikadesh et Yishai v'et banav. Vayikro lahem lazevach. I've come to bring a sacrifice. Purify yourselves. Prepare yourselves for the sacrifice. He invites Yishai and his children to come to the sacrificial meal. Fine. As he was told to do by God. Now we continue. Vayhi bevoam, vayaret Eliyav, vayomer, ach neged Hashem mishicho. You have to scroll down. Next verses. Right. When he came, he saw Eliyav. Eliyav is the oldest son of Yishai, and he said, I presume to himself, surely God's anointed stands before him. Neged Hashem. This must be the reason I came, says Samuel, because I came to anoint this one. This is probably the king. Vayomer Hashem o Shmuel, al tabeta mar'eu v'yogvo komato, ki miastiu. Ki lo asher yireh ha'adam, ki ha'adam yireh la'inayim, v'Hashem yireh la'levav. God says to Samuel, pay no attention to his appearance. I have rejected him, not as a human being sees. Humans only see what is visible. God sees into the heart. That's a very, very interesting verse. We're not studying the book of Shmuel now, but I just say one word about that. What does he see? What does Samuel see? He sees he's big and tall. Mar'eu gavoa komato. He's big and husky and tall. Says God, no. I have rejected him. It's a very strange expression, I have rejected him, because he was never chosen in the first place. God rejected Saul. Saul was the king.
And Saul was known for his height.
Saul is exactly what Samuel is seeing is another Saul. Samuel's sense of kingship is Saul, even though he rejects Saul. But for Shmuel, that's what a king looks like. And furthermore, there's something else about Saul. Saul, for those who study the book of Samuel, remember, no doubt, that Samuel tries to control Saul. And he does a pretty good job of controlling him. That's why that fails, because Samuel wants to control him. Samuel goes to the house of Yishai, He sees somebody like Saul. He says to himself, this must be the king. This is another Saul figure. We're going to continue the same path. Says God to Samuel, no, not the way you people see. You people see superficially. God can see what is in the heart. And here there's another point for those who study the book of Shmuel. What is Shmuel's title in the book of Samuel? Shmuel HaRoeh, seer. For in those days, says the writer of the book, they used to call a prophet a seer. See, the book was written much later, obviously. In those days, they called the Navi the Roeh. Shmuel HaRoeh. He's the seer who doesn't see. That's the point. Now, why he doesn't see, if you're studying the book of Samuel, and that is you study it with minus the apologetics, then you can figure out why Samuel can't see. And the fact of the matter is, it's one of the most important themes of the book of Samuel. Who can see and who can't see? When you want to control somebody else, you can never see. But that's who sees well. Hannah sees perfectly. She's an absolutely powerless woman. She sees everything. In any event, fine. Remember, when God sends Samuel to the house of Yishai, God said to Samuel in the beginning of the chapter, Ra'iti bivanav li melech. I have seen a king over there. Fine. Now Yishai has all the kids. Each one passes in front of Samuel. And Samuel says, no, God seems to have not chosen this one either. No, God didn't choose this one. Yishai Shama, son number 3. God didn't choose this one either. Notice the refrain, Bachar Hashem, Bachar Hashem. Recalls our verse in Dvarim, right? He has 7 kids. Each one passes in front of Samuel. God has chosen none of them. He was sent to go to the house of Yishai. He's seen all 7 kids. God said, I have seen a king from that house. I want to choose a king from there. But lo bachar Hashem. Vayomer Shmuel el Yishai, hatamu hanarim. Is that it? Any more kids? What's with Vayomer? Od sha'ar hakaton. V'nei roeh batzon. Oh, there's one left. Yeah, I didn't bother inviting him. There's the little guy. He's out with the sheep. He's a shepherd. Vayomer Shmuel el Yishai. Shulcha v'kochenu. Ki lo nosov ad bo po. So send him here. I'm not leaving till you send me the last of the children. Vayishlach vayiviyehu. So he sends for him and he brings him. V'hu admoni im yufei einayim v'tov roi. Vayomer Hashem kum mishachehu ki zehu. They brought him in. Here they translate admoni, ruddy-cheeked. Tov im yufei einayim, pretty eyes. Tov roi, handsome. They translate handsome. Tov roi and yufei einayim actually are typically not descriptions in the Bible of men. It sounds like it's much more of a feminine description. He's red. He's admoni. He has a reddish complexion, and he's pretty. He's pretty and he's red. And God said, "Arise and anoint him. This is the one." So let me just stop here for a moment and make the observation, which is this. First of all, why does God have to say to Shmuel, "Arise and anoint him," since there's nobody else left? He only has 8 kids. The first 7 were not chosen. So by process of elimination, obviously, the 8th one is going to be chosen. But it sounds like God has to say to Shmuel, no, arise and anoint him. It feels like there's some hesitancy on the part of Shmuel to anoint this youngest one who was never invited in the first place. He's out with the flock in the field. And second of all, what do we make of this description of him? Admoni im yefei einayim v'tov roi. So there are different ways to read it, actually. But I'm interested in this. He's red. He has a red complexion. Doesn't mean he's a redhead. He has a red complexion. And
Rabbi Silber. Rabbi Silber,
yes?
it's like this. It's like the Cinderella story. The most unlikely one gets chosen.
Right. Well, that is certainly the case. But what does the redness signify? So the redness can signify 2 different things.
Esav.
But when he meets Goliath in the next chapter, Goliath looks at him and he laughs. This is the one they send me. This little red boy. It sounds like the red for Goliath is similar to Yefei Einayim, this pretty boy. They're saying this pretty boy to fight me. I'm Goliath. That's one way to read it. But I think the book of Shmuel has a different take on the red, because there's only one other character in the Bible who's an Admoni. Of course, that is Esav.
Esav.
And in studying the book of Shmuel, Esav is a hunter. Esav's a killer. And you have this person stands in front of you. Maybe that's why Samuel can't know. On one hand, he's a pretty boy. On the other hand, he's a killer, which is what David is. And God says it explicitly. God says later in the book, I chose you to destroy my enemies. That's what God says to David in famous chapter 7 of the second book of Samuel. So there's something about David that's very interesting. On one hand, pretty. On the other hand, he's an Admoni. And in the book will play with this for those who study the book of Shmuel. And maybe that's why Samuel doesn't know what to do. This is the ex-king of Israel. Says God, arise and anoint him. This is the one that I want. In other words, Samuel, you may be a great prophet, but you're just a human being who sees superficially. Samuel the seer, you can't see anything. Only I can see into the heart. This is the one that I want. This is the fellow who I choose to do my bidding. And so, in other words, the point is, when you read these verses over here, it is obvious that the writer of this book of Shmuel has our verses of Devarim in mind. When you come into the land, you want a king like the nations, appoint for yourself a king, right? However, Asher Yivchar Hashem Elohecha Bo, the one that God chooses, okay? In the context, the way the book of Shmuel uses it, the one that God chooses means not the one that you think is right, because your instincts are not going to be right. So you have to try to figure out what God would want. That is to say, who's going to fill the role that God wants this particular king to fill. It just so happens in the book of Shmuel that God actually says explicitly what God wants, why God wants David, and makes it very clear. I want to destroy Israel's enemies, and this is the one who can do it. This is the one who has the ability to do it. So that's the first point. Bikerev achecha. I'm sorry. Asher yivchar Hashem Elohecha bo. And now, after God commands Shmuel to anoint him, right, in verse number 13, Vayikach Shmuel et keren Hashemen, vayimshach oto bikerev echav, vatitzlach ruach Hashem el David me'ayom ahu v'mala, vayakom Shmuel vayelach haramata. And here, when you read this verse number 13, Samuel, the prophet, obeys God's command. He anointed David bikerev echav, amongst his brothers. And the Spirit of God infused David. From that day moving forward, Shmuel leaves. Now the question is, we're not studying the book of Shmuel, but nonetheless, since the book of Shmuel here in this chapter, obviously, is directly relating to the verses that we have read about Asher Yivchar Hashem Bikerev Achecha, it's very interesting to try to figure out what does it mean he was anointed Bikerev Echav. Because when you read Bikerev Echav over here in the book of Shmuel, I'll make the obvious point, it can't possibly mean what it means in the Chumash. Bikerev Achecha tasim alecha melech, you shall choose a king from amongst your brethren. And by the way, if we go back to our parsha for a moment, which is chapter 17 of Dvarim, just to look back at that for a moment, and you read further in the parsha about the king. So the king is among, we'll get to this in a few minutes, but the king also has to write a Sefer Torah and also to read the Sefer Torah. And the reason for writing and reading the Sefer Torah in verse number 20 is Levilti rum livavo me'achav, or Levilti sur ben mitzvah yaminu smo. The king is commanded. The king has to write the Torah and follow the rules of the Torah, that he should not be haughty. He will not think of himself as more than his brethren. Levilti rum livavo me'achav. So there you see in the Torah already in verse number 20 that Mikarev Achecha is not just a technicality. You can't have a foreigner as king. Like in the United States, you got to be a citizen to become the president or whatever. But the point is, you got to be born in the United States or whatever to be the president. Here it's clear that Mikarev Achecha, given verse number 20, has a deeper significance. The king should not see himself as more than anybody else. The king should not be haughty. I'm the king. No, you're just one of the people. It's Mikarev Achecha. That's what it means in the Chumash. But what does it mean in the book of Shmuel? What does the writer of Samuel do with this verse? Because Mikarev Achecha in the book of Shmuel can't possibly mean what it means, or it doesn't sound like it means what it means in the Torah. Because the ach, right? The word ach in the Torah does not only mean your brother. Very, very often, right? Achicha in the book of Deuteronomy as well could mean part of your family. It could mean part of Israel. It says in Lo tisna et achicha bilvavecha. Do not hate your brother in your heart. Do not bear a grudge. That's not talking about your brother. Lo tisna et achicha bilvavecha hocheach tochiach. Right? You should rebuke him. Rebuke your brother. That means your brother. It means another Israelite. Mikarev Achecha tosim alecha melech can't possibly mean from amongst the family. Mikarev Achecha in the Chumash means from amongst the Jewish people. Jewish people are brothers. We are all brothers and sisters. It's a very important point. And many people seem to have forgotten, but that's a very important point.
The word came up a lot in Bahar, Achicha, that you should.
Of course, but that's not your brother. Now there it can mean a relative as well. In other words, there in terms of redeeming, there is a hierarchy but basically the word Achicha in general in the Bible does not mean a brother. It doesn't. It can mean a brother.
So, then, Rabbi,
or it means a fellow Jew. What?
So then maybe that's where the Midrashim come in and think that perhaps David wasn't really their brother, that the seven were a unit, and that this guy, this little runty guy who's taking care of the sheep and out of the house and wasn't even considered a brother, maybe he was the son of a concubine or son of a shifcha, because what you're saying is, if what you're saying is absolutely so the Bekarev Achicha can't mean really your actual brethren, then maybe it also means almost more largely, even though they considered it a detriment, maybe in the Samuel sense, it's to his credit that he really is part of your brethren, even if he's not your actual blood brother.
Could be. I mean, the point is that we discover in the next chapter, when David is sent by his father to bring provisions for his brothers who are in the army, and the Philistines are there with Goliath. And when David comes with the provisions, he starts asking questions, and they say to him, the oldest one says, "Who asked you to come here all together?" In other words, they're not necessarily his own brothers, don't necessarily like him at all. He's anointed amongst his brothers. It means actually his real brothers. But his real brothers, of course, in other words, the brothers don't care for him. That's for sure. The brothers suspect him. He's a show off, whatever he is. And the point is that.
And that's the Yosef story. And that's the Yosef story.
Right. And there's a lot of Josephs in the David character as well. But my point is a different point about kingship, which I think is very important, which the book of Shmuel is going to emphasize, which is there's a different tension. In the book of Shmuel, there's a different tension over here between the king. You had it with Saul as well. The king is coming from a certain place. The king has a family. The king has a tribe. The point of the book of Shmuel is Bikarev Achecha. It goes, in other words, the king's brothers. This is one of the very interesting features of the book. Your brothers are dafka, not your family. That's the point of the book. The brothers here can't stand the guy. But the point is what David has to come to understand, which I think he struggles with. It's one of the struggles in the book is that the king, and the prophet is the same, by the way. The king, the leader, has to leave his family. The leader can't be attached to his family. The king is a king of all the people. The king is not a king of his own immediate family. And for the book of Samuel, that's actually a challenge for David. One of the main challenges you have is with David and Avshalom, for example. Avshalom is the enemy of the Jewish people, but he's also David's son. And therein comes the actual, that's one of the things the book wrestles with this at every turn. The characters in the book are all actually family. David's main characters are family members. Yoav, his general, is David's nephew, basically. It's the son of David's sister. The point is they're all connected. And one of the issues is there's family, and then there's this job that you have. And those two things can't actually work together. If you're going to be the king, then you have to figure out who your brothers are. Now, in the book of Shmuel, already from the very beginning, this is set up because the so-called brothers, he's anointed amongst his brethren. And no doubt the writer of the book wants us to remember, but the brethren in the Chumash doesn't mean your brothers. Brethren in the Chumash obviously means the Jewish people, as opposed to the Nachri, someone who's outside the fold, different, not a Jew. And then you have Achecha. So the point I'm trying to make over here is, and the main point, is to demonstrate that the book of Shmuel, and this is not unique to the book of Shmuel, but here it's obvious. I want to develop this a little more. Reads the Chumash, and the writer of this amazing book is going to take this parsha in the Chumash and spin it in many different interesting ways. So that's as far as this description or this rule, that the one that God would choose and the one that from amongst your brethren. Now I just want to pick up with this point, then I'll stop and take all kinds of comments or questions. But I did want to make the following observation. And this is the point that I've spoken about and written about many times, actually, both in my Haggadah and in the book on kingship, which hopefully will come out soon in English in translation, Malchut Adam. And that is that the character of David in the book of Samuel, anybody who reads it with two open eyes and without apologetics, he's a deeply flawed character. Of this, there can be no question. He's the hero, but there are many stories in the book in which David comes across as extraordinarily problematic. Not just David Bathsheba, there obviously, but other stories as well. But we're not studying the book of Shmuel. But he has his great moments, and the truth of the matter is that the last chapter of Samuel, which is 2 Samuel, chapter 24, there you see the greatness, actually. And there you see that kingship is actually possible, unlike what Samuel thinks. Samuel thinks that kingship is not possible because, first of all, the king will rob you blind because power corrupts. And secondly, even worse than that, the king will seek to displace God. God is the only real king. That's Samuel's point of view. That's his point of view. The last chapter of the book of Samuel, we could spend many, many hours on this last chapter. I want to make one simple point. In the last chapter of Samuel, David decides in this chapter to take a census of the people. Why he wants to take a census of the people is not clear. Because there's no reason to take a census. Well, there seems to be absolutely no reason. What it sounds like is that after the David and Absalom civil war, and then the ensuing civil war between a man named Sheva ben Bichri, where 10 tribes desert David, and Yoav gets involved, and the tribes return to David. There's a real split in the nation. That David decides he's going to tell the world that he's the king, and these are his people. So he talks to his general Yoav in the beginning of chapter 24, 2 Samuel, chapter 24, and he instructs Yoav to take a census, to count all of the people. It's probably not all the people. Maybe it's all the people eligible for the army, but to take a general census. The story, which is in chapter 24 of Shmuel Bet, appears also in Divrei Hayamim, with some variations. In both of the chapters, there are all kinds of interesting variations. I'm not getting into that, but in each case, Yoav objects. The general says, "Don't do it. Do not do this. God should bless you 100-fold, right? But why would you do such a thing?" Yoav sees it as problematic. Whether he sees it as problematic from a political standpoint, whether he sees it problematic from a religious standpoint, is not our problem. But he sees it as problematic. When we're studying the book of Shmuel, we would deal with that at length. What is Yoav's objection? But he objects. Do not do it. Nonetheless, David insists on doing it. He insists on doing it. The two stories are parallel in that sense, both in here and Divrei Hayamim. He takes this, he goes throughout all the land, he gets all the numbers. By the way, in the book of Chronicles, two of the tribes refuse to be counted, by the way. The tribe of Levi refuses to be counted. I forget the other tribe, maybe it's done. They refuse to be counted. I think it's Binyamin, actually. Binyamin and Levi refuse to be counted. David counts them all. And after David counts them, in chapter 24, in verse number 10, Vayach lev David oto acherechen sofaret ha'am. After David took the census, he has all the numbers. David felt bad about it. Here they translate, reproached himself. He felt very bad. After he took the census, he realizes that taking the census was a terrible mistake. Terrible mistake. He shouldn't have done it. He regrets it. But David says to God, Chatati ma'od asher asiti. I have sinned grievously. V'ato Hashem haverno atavon avdecha. Oh God, please forgive the sin of your servant. Ki niskalti ma'od. I have been very, very foolish. Niskalti ma'od. I have been foolish, very foolish. Ma'od. And also, I have sinned ma'od. I have sinned grievously. Now, I'm not getting into all the details of this chapter, as I said, because there's so much to say about this. But I'll simply point out one thing over here. And that is, one can ask the question, David on his own accord, nobody told David that he sinned. The general had said, don't do it, but he didn't give a reason. But David goes ahead, and after David gets the numbers, gets the census numbers, he says to God, G-O-D, he says to God, forgive me, please. I have chatati ma'od, niskalti ma'od. Now, what's interesting is, if one thinks about the great sin of David in the book of Samuel, there are several, by the way, but the great obvious sin in the book of Shmuel is the story of David and Bathsheba. David essentially murders, or has Uriah the Hittite, his noble warrior, murdered, and then he takes Bathsheba as a wife, having already slept with her in adulterous fashion. When David is confronted by the prophet, who tells him a whole story, and David says, oh, that guy's terrible. And the prophet says to David, it's you. You're the guilty party. Vayomer David, chatati Lashem. And David says, I have sinned. That's what David confesses. Let me find that verse, just tell you where it is. It's in chapter 12, I believe. Yes, chatati Lashem. Chapter 12, verse number 13. Vayomer David, chatati Lashem, says David, I have sinned against God. And the prophet says, God will remove your sin, remit your sin, you will not die. However, you're going to be punished. Fine. And one can ask the obvious question, I think, how could it be that when it comes to David and Bathsheba, which is murder, adultery, cover up, you name it, it's chatati, I sinned. But when it comes to taking the census, it's chatati ma'od, and not just chatati ma'od, I have sinned grievously, but niskalti ma'od. How can we understand that? Whatever the prohibition of taking the census is, it doesn't even appear to be on the list of 613 commandments. But murder and adultery, those are two of the big ones. So how could this be? What is that about? Also interesting is that when it comes to the murder and adultery, the prophet has to tell him he did something wrong. But over here, on his own accord, right away he says, David is very troubled by this. Vayach lev David oto. He's terribly troubled by it. I have sinned grievously. I have been very foolish. Now, I write about that in the Haggadah. I wrote about that at length in the book on Shmuel, in Hebrew, Malchut Adam. And that my point is a very simple point. Simple, but very important point. And that is, you read a book, you have to understand what the book is about. I know that sounds obvious to all of you, but believe me, in practice, it's not so obvious. What is the book actually about? The book of Samuel is about one thing. It's about kingship. It's not about David. Rabbi Walter says we should call it the book of David. Wrong. That's a stupid idea. I think he calls it the book of David. It's not about David. It's about kingship. David actually is the hero, in the sense, the main character of the book. Saul's a different kind of kingship, which may be even more ideal than David's. It's not about David. It's about kingship and the dangers of kingship. And Samuel's against kingship for reasons that he states and I mentioned before. And the main issue Samuel's got with kingship, apart from the fact that the king will rob you blind, take things, etc., try to make himself rich and his friends rich and all that. And human history doesn't suggest that Samuel was wrong about that. But Samuel's main problem is you have a king, namely God. God is the king. And here, that's the problem. When you take a census, what in effect are you saying? You're saying these are my people. In the Chumash, you take the census through the Mishkan. The money, the half shekel donated to the Mishkan, is the way to take the census, the way you count the people. Pikudei ha-Mishkan, Mishkan ha-Idut. That's the way you count. That is to say, we are a people by virtue of the fact that we are God's people. That's what makes us a nation. We are God's people. God's people is the nation. What does it mean to take an unnecessary census that the king is going to take? That's the ultimate crime in this book. I mean, murder, adultery are a crime, personal, of course, personal. They're also a different crime because the king thinks he can take whatever he wants. So it is related to that. But the real crime is when you say, I am God. And that's what David understands. That's what David understands on his own. He says, God, please forgive me. David prays, Haver no, remove my sin. I've been so foolish. And what God does is God sends a prophet, God, G-A-D, not G-O-D. God sends, but in the next verse, God sends God the prophet. And the prophet is instructed by God to say, I give you three choices. You want to be forgiven, you have to accept the punishment. Three choices. What do you want? Here are the three choices, Hobbesian choices. 7 years of famine, 3 months of running away from your enemy, it means war, or 3 days of plague. You tell me, what do you want? You choose. You're going to make the choice. I'll do whatever you want. 7 years of famine, 3 months of war, 3 days of plague. What do you want? And David's response in verse number 14, which appears in our liturgy, at least of the Ashkenazim, it's called the introduction to Tachanun. Vayomer David el God sari ma'od, nipwana biyad Hashem ki rabim rachamav uviyad adam alepola. What is David's answer? In short, David says, I'd rather be in God's hands. I'm in God's hands. So in terms of the choice, you gave me three choices, A, B, or C. What does David say? I eliminate choice number B. Choice number B was running away from your enemy. Now that's war. That I don't want. I don't want to be in the hands of a human being. But given the other two choices, which are famine or plague, says David, I'm in your hands. You choose. In other words, what is David saying? David's saying, no. You came to me and said, you choose, David. You king. You tell God what to do. You're the king. You tell God what to do. Says David, no. God chooses. I don't tell God what to do. I will eliminate the middle choice because I'll be in human hands, but I am in God's hands. Now, of course, the punishment in the Torah for counting is actually plague, but David doesn't make the choice. I'm not getting into that now. But the point is, David has passed the first part of the test. What is the first part of the test? Do you understand, King, that you're in God's hands? Do you understand that? And David understands it. That's what David says. David says, okay, I'm in your hands. You make the choices. The king doesn't choose. The king works for God. God makes all the decisions. You have passed test number one. But now the plague comes. And in the plague, many thousands of Israelites die. Now, one, of course, can ask the question, why do many thousands of Israelites die? Because of David's sin. That's a very good question. In fact, David himself says that a few verses later. But the answer, which is a simple answer, despite the fact that this simple answer seems to have eluded virtually every commentary I have seen on the book of Samuel. I'm talking mostly about the moderns, whether it's Alter, whether it's Fackelman, they don't understand it. That the point of chapter 24 of Samuel, which is the last chapter, is to take you back to the core issue of the book, which is the core issue of Sefer Devarim in what we have studied, namely the responsibility of the king. The king has two responsibilities. The king has a responsibility to God and responsibility to the people. Now, in terms of the people dying over here, what the book goes in the last chapter goes back to the very request for a king in the first place. When you come into the land and you say, I want a king like all the other nations, which is what the people say. That's exactly what the people say. Sima lanu melech kechol hagoyim. They would say that twice to Samuel. We want a king like all the other nations. For Samuel, it's the request for kingship that's problematic. But for God, that's not what's problematic. What's problematic is like all the other nations. What do you mean the other nations? I'm your God. What do you mean the other nations? So the request for kingship, that was the people's request. David goes along with it. David does all kinds of things. But the bottom line is, it was the people's request. And therefore, the punishment is the people. In fact, the chapter begins with the verse, Vayosef ach Hashem lacharot b'Yisrael. God's anger continued to rage against Israel, not against David. God is angry with Israel because the request for kingship, and that kind of request, like all the nations, that was Israel's doing. So now Israel's going to die. But in the story of Israel dying and the destructive angel, which hovers above Jerusalem, and we have in verse number 17 of chapter 24, Vayomer David el Hashem, Biroto et hamalach hamakeh ba'am, Vayomer hine anochi chatati, anochi aviti, Eilat son me'osu, Tino yodcha bi u'veveit David. David says, even though I just explained it's not actually true, doesn't matter. But what David says is, listen, I took the census. I sinned. It's my fault. Why should these people die? Oh God, strike me down in my father's house. What does it mean, my father's house? Strike me down in my father's house. It means the kingship. It means if my being king means people suffer, I shouldn't be the king. So God, don't strike them down. Strike me down. I'm willing to renounce the kingship. I'll give it all up. There'll be all the promises. I renounce the promises because I'm not serving the people. Vayavo God el David. On that very day, the prophet goes back to David. Aleho came Mizbeach, Hashem Mizbeach begoren Aravna Hayevusi. Set up an altar in the threshing place of Aravna. It's written Aleph Reish Vav Nun, the word Aron. Takes you back to the beginning of the book. Oh, now I see you actually understand kingship. You understand that you work for God. You understand you work for the people. It means you actually can be the king. And I want you now to bring a threshing, an altar in the threshing place of Mr. Ark. And the Goren Aravna, of course, is the place of the Beit HaMikdash, of the temple. David, you will secure eternal kingship in God's city. The city of David will be the city of God forever because you actually understand kingship. You understand what the king is required to do, how the king is required to think. And this is the conclusion in typically the chapter 24 of 2 Samuel is the last chapter of Samuel. Now, the next two chapters of Kings are also related to the book of Samuel. That's not our problem here. There's so much more to say. But my point is, what I'm trying to demonstrate is that how the book of Shmuel reads our Parsha. And I would say beyond that, it's an example of how the book of Shmuel, and I chose the book of Shmuel because it's a book that I've spent a lot of time with, written about it. It's one of the great literary works, period. And everybody who does any literary work on the Bible studies the book of Shmuel, obviously. But the point is, it's not unique to the Shmuel, the reading of other texts. But here you have an interesting thing. There's a reading of what I call a kind of legislative text. When you come into the land, the king should do this, not do this. And the book of Shmuel takes that parsha and plays with it and interprets it in such interesting ways. So this is how the book of Shmuel reads. Number one, Asher Yivchar Hashem, and Mikarev Achecha. And here in the last chapter, it comes to mean somebody who understands that God calls the shots. God is the boss. You have to do things in line with God's values. And second of all, your role is to serve. It's not about you. And if you can't serve, get out. Who needs you? And the fact of the matter is, which is true of, I think, of not just kingship, it's true of institutions in general. If you're doing a good job, keep doing it. If you're not doing anything, don't do it. Who needs you? Institutions themselves have no value per se. It's the service. So the fact is that the book of Shmuel understands that it has David in the last chapter, actually, with all his problems, has David understanding this. That David's greatness is he actually has the ability to understand. His own ego and his own needs, or perceived needs, often get in the way, as they do for all of us. But David's able to step back and to see this objectively without being told by the prophet, without being given a parable. In the last chapter of Shmuel, he comes to understand it himself and act upon it and be willing to give it all up. And that's exactly precisely when God says to David, you should build the altar in the threshing place of Aravna, Mr. Aaron of the ark. Okay, that's what I want to say about chapter 24. Now I have one more thing I'd like to say about this parsha of the king in terms of how it's understood. But before I do that, if anybody has any comments or questions, please speak up.
Yes, I want to highlight something from chat. This is from a while back ago from Aviva Davidson. Quote, relationship between the brothers and David is reminiscent of Yosef and his brothers in both stories. That the chosen son is hated by his brothers. End quote.
That's true. That is certainly the case. Hated by him. I would also say that in the case of Joseph, by the way, the Yosef story, the book of Shmuel, which factors in many, many stories in its telling, does play off the Joseph story on more than one occasion. In the case of Joseph, I would say, and maybe the case of David as well, I think there's a dislike of David by his brothers. There's no question about that. There is certainly a dislike of Joseph by his brothers. Part of that is he's seen as boastful and putting them down, and all that's true. But there's another aspect of the Joseph story for sure, and probably the David story as well, and that is that they don't actually understand Joseph. In other words, Joseph is somebody in the story who a lot of people don't like him. I mean, because they don't understand him. In other words, Joseph has a different way to see the world. When Joseph says to his brothers, don't feel so bad that you sold me. This was God's will. This was God's will. When most people say that, if someone said that to me, I would say, are you kidding or what? Are you kidding? You tell me, I don't believe that. But in the case of Joseph, when you read the Joseph narrative from beginning to end, it actually sounds like it's true. In other words, Joseph sees himself as God's agent. Now, agent for what purpose? He initially thinks that he's God's agent to sustain the family, to give them food, not just them food, but the people of Egypt, not just Egypt, but the world. He supplies the world with food. And that is certainly true. But it's only at the very end of his life that he comes to a deeper understanding that I was part and parcel of this covenantal process. And actually, I have come to enslave all of us because this is part of the covenantal process. And I am with you in the covenantal process. And after I die, take my body back with you because we're in this together. That's when he comes to understand at the end of his life. But Joseph, from the Torah, in two different places, calls the Nazarite. What Joseph is, he has a different way to see the world. That's Joseph. And I suspect that David also has a different way to see it. You see that in the next chapter, David and Goliath. David sees Goliath differently. David sees the Jewish people differently. He sees them as God's people, actually. He says it to Goliath. Now, the interesting thing about the book of Samuel is that David is a very tough character to figure out because there's always many different things at the same time. There's always his personal interest. There's always what's said for public consumption. There's always the possibility that he's doing God's work. And with David, it's very, very hard typically to know what actually drives him. He's very political. He's very astute politically. He's very manipulative. He uses a lot of people in some quite nasty ways. But he does have a plan, and I think he does understand that his mission is to protect the people. But what makes the book so incredibly interesting is he's a very complicated character. But I think the David Joseph parallel is certainly in the book. Again, we're not studying the book of Samuel, but it appears in more than one place. This idea of the person that's not understood, the youngest one or the almost youngest one, etc. Has a different way to see things. The ones that the family doesn't like him, to put it mildly, etc. All that is certainly the case in the David story. We're not studying the book of Shmuel. I've taught it a couple of times in the past. It's the greatest, but we can't really do everything. So, anyway, let me just make one other point about how the.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, go ahead. Go right ahead, please.
I guess struck or confused. First, God tells Shmuel to not look at the physical appearance of the potential future king. And then 2 psukim later,
Yes.
we hear about the appearance of the potential future king.
Right, but his appearance is exactly not. The appearance is what's problematic. In other words, the point is with the appearance, Samuel thinks of kingship a certain way. As we all do, we have a certain image of what does this leader look like? You know what I mean? And I think what God is saying is that's a mistake to assume that the leader has to look a certain way, because the leader that I want can look completely different. And the image of David that we have is extremely striking. First of all, it's especially a feminine image. It's a pretty boy. Even the redness could be that. On the other hand, given the fact that book of Samuel, as the other great books work with intertext, we remember the only other redhead is actually Esau. And then you have a different picture of a pretty boy who is a killer. You ever seen Clockwork Orange? Clockwork Orange is that. It's frightening, actually. A pretty boy, he's a killer. He's very pretty. He's a cold-blooded killer. And that's what David is. Now, David hopefully will kill only his enemies or Israel's enemies. Sometimes, though, he kills his own people. It's David and Bathsheba. He kills his best general. He kills the Uriah Hittite, a noble warrior. So that's always the danger. And it's the danger for the book of Shmuel because it's always easy to pin it on somebody else if you have the power. The guy on top can always blame others. But that's another story. But the picture of David is one that's actually sort of antithetical. It's everything Samuel would not think of in a million years, which is why God has to say, this is the one that I know doesn't look like a king to you. That's because you can't see. Oh, Samuel, the Roe who can't see. Oh, only I can see. That's a very basic theme in the book of Shmuel, who can see and who cannot see. The people in power have a tough time seeing. The outsiders see much better. They have the critical distance, and they're not vested. So that Hannah can go to Shiloh and see the place is utterly corrupt. But her husband goes there joyfully periodically. He doesn't see it. How do you get yourself to be able to see? That's one of the issues in the book of Shmuel. But again, we can't go too far with this now because it's not our topic. Let me just conclude with one thought. I'll maybe finish this next week. And that is that back to our parsha about the king, what the king has to do, the king has one commandment, which is we're told what the king can't do. The word is excess. Not too many wives, too many horses, etc., etc. I'll touch on that maybe next week in the last session and move on to something else. But what the king has to do, he has to write in verse number 18, Kishivtoach yisei mamlachto v'katav lo mishneh Torah hazot al sefer milufnei hakohanim halviyim. The king has to write a sefer. Now, exactly what is in the sefer we don't know, but it says Mishneh Torah. The book of Devarim is called Mishneh Torah. So many commentaries assume what the king has to write is the book of Devarim. Others say that's too long a book for the king to write. Maybe Mishneh Torah means the parsha in Mishneh Torah that relates to the king, which is this parsha over here. That's another point of view. Maybe, whatever it is, he has to write a sefer. Now, when you have the idea of the king writing a sefer, that appears, well, it appears in several places in the Bible, but there are two of them that are certainly connected to each other, and maybe the third is connected. The king writing Sfarim, the place where it's most obvious as a central theme, is a book that's near and dear to all of us called Megillat Esther. There we know that there are various Sfarim that are sent out in the kingdom of Achashverosh. First is about the women honoring their husbands, speaking the husband's language. Then there are two others, and there's two other Sfarim, of course, that are significant to the Jews specifically. One is to murder all the Jews, and the second is that the Jews are on the right side, and the king wants to. Jews have the right to self-defense. Okay, so but the sefer, the king writing the sefer, what's unique to everything the king writes, the Sfarim of Achashverosh, they're all intended to benefit the king. That's for sure. The presumed benefit to the king. Get rid of the king's enemies, find the king a new wife, build up his harem, get rid of the people opposing the Jews who are now with the king's friends, etc. But there are two other places in the Bible where we have kings or king's associates writing a sefer. One of them, of course, and I'll just mention the first one now, is in the book of Shmuel. The story of David and Bathsheba. We all know the story. David has slept with Bathsheba when the husband is away in battle and sends her home, and the story could end over there. The problem is she sends him back a note, a letter, or whatever. She tells him, messenger, whatever, Vayishlach, I am pregnant. And that's a problem for David, twofold problem, a personal problem, but a problem for the kingship as well. Because this kid could be the next king. And would he have has a kind of a alternate family line. Kings don't want that. David has to solve that problem. So first he tries to solve it by summoning Uriah home. Nobody will know who the father is. That doesn't work. So David, what does David do? After a couple of days, he can't get him to go home to his wife. So he gives them a sefer. The sefer says essentially, he hands it to Uriah the Hittite. He gives him the sefer to deliver back to the general. Uriah is one of the noble warriors of David. And the sefer basically says, it's a sealed sefer. He won't open it. Uriah anyway wouldn't open it. He's a noble person. Don't open someone else's mail. And Uriah certainly would not do that. David knows that. Essentially, if we boil it down to two words, the sefer says, kill me. He gives Uriah the letter, but the letter describes how to kill him. David's instructions are, take him out to battle, withdraw the troops from Uriah, and the enemy will kill him. In other words, have him die in battle, not really in battle. Have him die in battle, and nobody will know how he died. He'll be presumed to be a casualty of war, and I will get rid of, David's thinking is, I'll get rid of this problem. There won't be any Uriah around. I'll then take Bathsheba as my own wife, which he does. Problem solved. So, but the point is, the king in the book of Shmuel, we saw this, it's only in the book of Shmuel that the book tells us what a king's role, what is the king's job. The king has two jobs. Shvatanu Malkenu, the king should be a judge. V'nuchamet Melchamotenu, he shall go before us and fight our wars. David is using the war itself for his own purposes, for his own unholy ends. And he writes a sefer. Now, there's no question that the book of Shmuel, having read the parasha of the king very well, writes up the story of Uriah as such, that the king is writing a sefer with exactly the opposite purpose of what it says in the Torah. The point of writing a sefer in the Torah, the Mishnah Torah, is the king should fear God and obey all of God's rules and not see himself as better than anybody else, than his brethren. The story of David and Bathsheba is a king who says the rules don't apply to me, don't apply to the king. I'm a king. They apply to the other people, but not to me. And he's going to use the sefer to get away with the crime, and not just the sefer, but the very job that he has to do, which is to prosecute the war. He's going to use the very war itself, not to eliminate his enemies, but Tulay made his own personal enemy as of sorts, not Uriah's fault, to take care of his own personal problem. So that's the Sefer here. Now, the Sefer appears one other prominent place in the Bible. Maybe we'll talk about that a little bit next week and talk about a little bit more about the kingship, a topic near and dear to my heart, and then to look at the parsha which precedes it, which is the parsha of the High Court, the parsha which follows, of course, was the Kohen and the Levi, and then say something about the prophet. And these are the four institutions that we have beginning in chapter 17 and running through chapter 18. I have to stop at this point. We'll
Rabbi,
continue
can you
next week. If any
mention
questions
what
or
that
anything,
fourth, Rabbi, just mention what that fourth place is, even though we're going to go into it next week.
I'm really sorry.
the place is the Sefer, of course, is the Sefer that King Achav's wife writes.
The Jezebel
Get rid
one.
of the Jezebel. Yes, that's a Sefer.
Right. Thank
We
you.
will discuss it next week.
Thank
Okay,
you.
very good. I have to stop here now.
I'm really
See you
sorry to
next
cut
week.
everyone
Thank
off.
you.
We do have to end on time. I'm sorry to cut everyone off. Thank you for your questions, for your thoughts, whether we got to them or not. Take care, everyone.
Right, we can start
And
next week. I'll start with next week. You can start with the questions next week. Before we start, if anybody has questions, I'll begin next week. Try to respond to the questions or comments, etc.
Okay. Thank you so
all
much.
very much.
Yasha Koach.